Hi, and welcome back to our reading from The Jesse Tree by Geraldine McCaughrean and illustrated by B. Wiley. Today's chapter is called The Wisdom of Solomon. Near the jar of oil that stood for Samuel, Mr. Butterfield had carved a sling and a crown to represent King David. Close by, he carved a gateway, two pillars, and an arched entryway over the top. "Is that David's palace?" asked the boy. The carpenter had grown so used to these daily visits that he no longer jumped when a shadow fell across his work and a small finger reached to stroke the wood. "This is the great temple in Jerusalem, Solomon's temple. You must have heard of Solomon. There were fairy tales written about him. He was so famous. Flying carpets, genies in a bottle, that sort of nonsense." "Can't you do genies then?" said the boy, as if the gates were boring by comparison. "I'm not carving fairy stories. I'm carving Bible stories. At least I would be, if people would just let me get on with it. Solomon's temple was real." And before anyone could ask him to, he was telling the story of Solomon's temple. Solomon was David's son, but whereas David could be not quite so smart sometimes and downright wicked on occasion, Solomon was wise and good as any hero in a fairy tale. One day, God asked him what gift he would like best. Now, you or I might have said money, or peace and quiet, or long life, but not Solomon. He thought to himself, "I'm a king, and what do I know about anything? I'm as foolish as someone who's never been to school." So he asked God to grant him some wisdom. God was so delighted that God gave everything else to Solomon as well. Good looks, victory, love, wealth, everything. Out of that wealth, Solomon built a temple. God designed it, and Solomon followed the plans. Together they came up with a building so immense and beautiful that in time the world came to marvel at it. And if visitors were impressed by the temple, they were impressed still more by the king. Solomon was a poet, a statesperson, and a judge from the start. It seemed as if there was no problem he just couldn't solve. So it was to Solomon that people brought their quarrels, their lawsuits, their problems, and complaints. It was also to Solomon that one day two women had come, thrusting a crying child into his face and demanding a judgment. "She is trying to steal my baby. Tell her she can't." "Don't believe a word she says. He's mine. Anyone will tell you." Two women, one child. Someone had to be lying. Rachel said that Miriam had stolen her baby when her own had died in the night. Miriam said that she was quite the other way around. The room filled with the feeble wailing of the child, the swearing of oaths, and the vowing of vows. Solomon put his hands over his ears. "Stop! Silence! Be still!" All but the baby fell silent. Solomon studied the red-faced creature in his lap. Then he stood up and laid the baby on the floor. Perhaps he did not want his robes dirtied. "Are there witnesses?" he asked. There were none. "Is there any proof or evidence?" There was only the word of the women. "Then let the prize be shared between them." And he called for a sword. His face was blank, his voice as sharp and as cold as a blade. The women gasped. The king seized up the sword stroke needed, the upswing, the force, the size of the target. Then he lifted the blade to cut the baby in two. "Stop!" Rachel dropped to her knees and leaned across the baby as if to shield it with her body. "Stop! Don't! She can have him. I withdraw my claim. Only don't hurt him. Let him live." Her eyes were like two deep wounds in her face. Miriam gave a yelp of victory. Solomon laid aside the sword. "Now I have the evidence I needed. he said, and his voice was as soft as velvet, as gentle as a mother's voice. Tenderly lifting the baby, he laid it, not in Miriam's reaching arms, but in Rachel's. A child's true mother would sooner break her own heart than harm her child, said Solomon. I now know that he is yours. The court ushers grabbed roughly at Miriam, the proven liar, the wicked stealer of the baby, threatening her with fines, punishment, and imprisonment. But Solomon waved them away. Last night, this woman's child died. Has she not lost enough already? The court session was over. The palace fell silent, but for the distant bang and clatter of building work up at the great temple. Solomon's soul turned inward to that quiet inner reservoir of stillness that made him so wise. This was where he talked to God and composed poetry about love. Strangely enough, at the heart of Solomon's temple, there was just such a place. People called it the Holy of Holies, an inner room furnished with stillness, where holiness itself could be found. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then the boy said, Solomon couldn't have been all that foolish to begin with, or he never would have asked God for wisdom, would he? True. But he did know about you and me, old Solomon? Mr. Butterfield narrowed his eyes. No, he admitted cautiously. He wasn't a prophet. But we know about him, right? Said Mr. Butterfield, sensing a quick trick question. So that makes us wiser than Solomon, doesn't it? And the boy ran out of the church, laughing delightedly. Hearing the door reopen, Mr. Butterfield retaliated. You're not wise, lad. You're just too clever for your own boots. Then he glanced up, grinning, and saw that he had insulted the minister by